It's a pleasure to meet everybody here. After working a long time in corporate innovation at large companies, I started to see that there was some patterns behind getting this all to work. So worked at a handful of large corporations, like I said, and actually was in venture capital, working for Mark Cuban for a couple of years, and started to see things differently from the venture capital perspective, and have spent the last probably 5 or 6 years bringing that back to the corporate world and thinking about how that all works. So recently we launched our software Productable, and we're actually working with the US Air Force. And so they're our main client that we're helping go from a really antiquated 700,000 person organization to transforming to the ideal future state kind of organization that we really would like the DoD to be. So for our fun exercise today, talking about bringing everything from theory to practice, we're going to give you a little taste of what we've learned with the Air Force, and hopefully that's enough context to actually think about how to bring innovation from theory to practice. So my hope is that with some real data and some real examples, you guys can look at this and go, wow, this is so simple. Let's just go ahead and get started with some of these pieces. I'll start with simple and we'll go from mild to wild. And my hope is that we'll have enough conversation time at the end to really engage on some of these pieces. So I'm going to just kind of go through them pretty quickly so that we have enough time to chat. But in the meanwhile, welcome to the US Air Force. We're so excited to have you as our head of innovation for this 700,000 person organization. So we're really glad to have you on board. No pressure at all, but you're meeting with the Vice Chief next week, the number 2 of the Air Force, and he wants to know how innovation is going, and he wants to know what all your plans are for it. So hopefully that's not too stressful, but I think that we're going to be able to help you out and make your life a little bit easier. So one of the big things so taking a little bit of a step back of trying to figure out how can we actually wrangle this 700,000 person organization, we learned really quickly, and I learned this in the startup world, just get started. So rather than us thinking about theory and getting all the pieces in the order of ideal state, just getting the ball rolling can start getting the right stakeholders engaged and figuring out how to get things going. So number one, what projects do people think are innovation and who are the owners? So simple enough. We just literally start making a list of who are all of our projects and who are the owners. I imagine a lot of people here have probably already done this part, but maybe this is a really good start to keep it simple. I had to start easy, low bar, right? And then the next thing that we found was really helpful was establishing a cadence. So this is actually a pretty big one that I've seen has been really effective in the venture capital community that I've seen less of in the corporate world. So in the venture capital world, it's very common for venture capitalists to ask their innovators for regular updates. What are your barriers? What are your wins? What do you need help with? And whether it's every 2 weeks or once a month, really helping them actually figure out what they need and actually unblocking it for them and creating that standard relationship where you're constantly expecting something moving. So we took that from the venture world and actually started creating a regular meeting in the Air Force every 2 weeks. We understand these things. And one of the companies I worked at, we actually ran this meeting every single day. And by talking about innovations every single day, it forced that progress and thinking about how do they continuously move forward. So here you can see this is going to be our little growing cheat sheet, but we started to create our projects. We have our portfolio status. How often are we checking on it? And then, we're starting to get some barriers and wins that we're collecting regularly from our projects. So the next way of how do we keep leveling this up? So what I'll say is we did this week over week. So every week we get a little bit more, every time we get a little more sophisticated. So we had to keep growing our sophistication. So now we actually start thinking about standard stages of effort. And what we found is, and I imagine some people know this here too, is that we want to make sure that we're thinking about building something that there's a clear problem to solve, that it's feasible, we can actually prototype it, that we can pilot it, that we can scale it, and that we actually start to create some standardization around what are the stages of developing an idea, and then who are the people who own that stage that actually decide if something meets those requirements or not. So by setting clear owners to stages, we're basically allowing an expert to become the person who is in charge of deciding what good looks like. And I'm showing you the minimum viable version, but ultimately there can be many portfolio owners for a single stage, but that's probably for more than a 10-minute talk that we have here. So at a high level, then we actually started to break out stages. As you can see, super simple. Stage 1, prototype. Stage 2, pilot. Stage 3, scale. We're thinking about what the milestones are and who the owners are. Next from there, once we've set clear stages, then we can actually set clear decision criteria. Because we've decided who's in charge, what the milestone is, now we can actually say, well, what do we expect an innovation to achieve? And then what are the supporting metrics for it? So from here, essentially, then we can actually start to say for every single stage, here's the criteria that's specific. We want to understand for the problem to solve, is there a TAM, SAM, SUM, or like there's a market for it? Or maybe for that the idea solves the problem, we can see the features. You can see here, these are not perfect solutions. All of you could probably debate with me why we should have this metric or that one, or why it should work a certain way. The main thing though, is we just want to get started. And we want to get some basic metrics and basic things working out there so that we can constantly, skipping ahead a little bit, but we can constantly improve and adapt these things. That next piece is, whoops, sorry about that. This next piece is standardizing the reports and the data. So essentially we want, once we know what the decision is, once we've set all of that standard material that we want to collect for a decision, then we can actually start figuring out how are we collecting that data. So what that means is if I have understood that I care about TAM, SAM, SUM, then I can actually start to create a process where I say, this is the way that we collect that information. We get a persona, we understand the pain, we understand the market size, we set a competitor feature list, and we actually start setting standard ways of collecting that. So ultimately what that allows is that when somebody pitches us that they want to move to the next stage, that we have really clear data that we're collecting from a project, and we can actually take that project and then say that we want to see essentially that key information from them. So as you can see here, we had a project around creating new schedules for flight simulations. So the problem here was that a flight teacher wants to be able to set, they're manually setting flight schedules to teach, and it's taking 30 hours a week for them to manually set these schedules. There's 3,000 flight teachers, there's 20,000 manual flight efforts, and 100,000 manual processes. So there's a lot of opportunity to change all of this. So they've understood the problem. They understood all the ways that this is done currently with Excel and email and hands-on. And so they decided that they could prototype a codeless app, and that they could build some key features that are described below that could actually solve this. So by standardizing essentially the data that we're looking for, then it makes it so much easier for the innovators to know what to show and actually get buy-in to a yes. One of the biggest challenges that I've seen in my career is that when innovators don't know what to prove and who they're supposed to prove it for and how to move something forward, they're just spinning their wheels 900 different directions trying to figure out how to actually move something forward and get buy-in to it. So by creating this kind of standardized system, what we're really doing is just creating a way for ideas to really move through the pipeline, the same way that we would see in sales or see in marketing or see in some of the other types of pipeline level of efforts. And the magic happens here that now that we have a system, essentially, ideally, leadership can start to buy into the idea that we can actually start to fund things at different stages with standard check sizes and standard expectations of failure. We want to spend lots of tiny checks at early stages and lots of where we could fail a lot. And then at late stages, we want to be able to have a lot bigger checks with lower fail rates. So ultimately, we're creating these stages here where we can have check sizes and fail rates that are associated with each stage so that we can actually start to think about how many ideas does it take to get in to actually create something at scale that's coming out. So what we're really doing here is moving from a place where we had a list of projects to ultimately moving into a system where that system can actually we're creating a machine. We understand we put a certain amount of ideas in, they're going to create a certain amount of outcomes out, which we didn't talk about outcome measurement yet, but that's because this is beginner portfolio and getting started. But ultimately, this is leading us to the kinds of things that can allow us to set those kinds of outcomes. So very much in what I was just describing, we want to continuously improve this and mature this. So what happens is then we can take that model that we just had and slide issue, and essentially be able to improve it from there. So we want to look at how can we continuously improve this model and grow things like outcomes and think more about more of these kinds of variables that we want to put into the system. But then also, how are we going to improve it in terms of, are these the right decision criteria? Are these the right stages? Are these the right owners? So essentially what we're doing is putting some information out there, refining it, but then also creating more data that we're putting in there at a time. And so we're creating a standard set of information that everybody can start to align on, and then we're growing that capability together. I know that was super high level, but there's a lot of people here and I really wanted to be able to engage with everybody. So I'm happy to dive into any of those pieces. That was a really fast overview, but looking forward to talking about any of the pieces that were interesting to anybody.
That's great, Rachel. Thank you so much. Really great kind of overview of, stages and processes and moving through them. And we want to definitely open this up to the floor, but I'll just pose kind of my first question and curiosity, which was the different stages in the relationship between them. You had kind of a lower check size and a higher risk percentage in the earlier stages, and then kind of those change and risk goes down and check sizes go up as the idea evolves. Right there, right? Stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. Can you talk a little bit about the handoff between those different stages? Is there a mechanism, or I hate to use the word process, but is there some type of a practice that you would recommend for evolving from kind of one specific stage to the next?
Is your question about how the innovations evolve or how the management of the pipeline evolves?
Both, really.
So for starters, having the clear owner, Bob here. Bob is in charge of the prototype process. He's in charge of intake into it. So the biggest thing I just want to call out is a lot of large companies, what they do is they set exit criteria. And what we actually see in startup world is entry criteria. And so exit criteria means, hey, we've decided that you're good enough, so we're going to throw you into the ether of the next thing in the unknown. And that's how you fall into the valley of death. And so one of the big insights that we've seen from the venture world is you actually want to have that intake opportunity. You're getting taken into a portfolio. So Bob actually accepted, Sim Schedule into his portfolio by meeting the decision criteria that was important for him to get into that portfolio. And then in the same way, Tina is going to evaluate her projects based on the milestones and data that she said that are important to her. So by having a clear decision owner who sets that intake and creating that space where it could be her and maybe it's a committee, a few people, but having a handful of clear people that are the deciders and they say what's in, then ultimately their goal is to get you into the next portfolio and get that deal flow into that next place. And so if we start off really simple with like one milestone and 3 criteria, it will naturally evolve when we actually get data in and we see, hey, that criteria was totally wrong. What should we do right now? But how do we make it better next time? And so it's that creating that space for the evolution and improvement of it, but also making that clarity for the innovation to move through.
Oh, thanks for that. I love that distinction of the exit criteria as well as the entry criteria. It's great. And clearly those will need to marry up somehow. So thanks for that. We do have a couple other questions coming in. Jennifer, do you want to come on, Mike, and come on camera and ask your question directly to Rachel? If not, I'm happy to convey it on your behalf.
I'd love to. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm a portfolio manager and I'm asking my projects all the time for updates. And that was one of the first things you talked about, that cadence and getting regular updates. And so I'm always torn between asking for updates just for the sake of reporting versus getting really valuable information that helps me take decisions about funding, about are they still going in the right direction? Are the roadmaps laid out in the right way? Are we going at the right speed and velocity that I'm expecting them to go? And so what's your advice on that, the check-in specifically? What would you say is the most valuable information that you get out of those?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think a lot of it comes down to also if you're doing this more of in a human way or in an automated way.
Yeah.
So like, let's say a beginner world, like beginner relationship world, like just starting the relationship, it's super hands-on and it's really at what's comfortable for their cadence and getting them comfortable with you and building and maintaining that relationship. But something, I guess this is kind of drawing from my Mark Cuban company's experience of, I'm thinking back to when we had like 200 portfolio companies and we're trying to, and Mark's saying, where's the progress on everybody? And we're trying to figure out what to solve. What happened was the reality is it just doesn't make sense to show progress for every single company, every single week, all the time. And so in that situation, we put relationships up and we actually just focused on like the highest priority things to move forward. And so rather than trying to force everybody to have something important all the time, which can then create stress, we found that just really focusing on the key ones that we think are close to a decision. We know about the barrier. And really focusing on those. And then what happens is then they build a certain amount of trust. And when it gets to more automated kind of systems, which like what we're doing at Productable, for example, that people have the trust and understand like they can share quickly, I have a barrier, I have a win or something like that, that they'll start to bring the information to you over time once they understand how it works. But I would say it was definitely much more personal and focused to get the ball rolling, if you will. Does that answer your question?
Yes, and it well, yes and no, but it totally confirms what I thought. There's no one fits all structure. Like to automate that at all is a bad idea. I feel like with that relationship building is building that level of trust that they would even share also failures or risks or barriers or issues with you that ultimately then actually help you take better decisions. But if you don't have that relationship, they won't even do that. They'll always just tell the great story. So that's I can follow that very well. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, it's super interesting. Well, I would say it starts, I guess I'll put a little turn on it that it starts relationship and that's how it starts to work. But what we found is that we were able to then get people to fill things out and to like actually share information in more scalable ways. And it was really just about finding, the right way to pull that information from people to get it from them. But we were able to move to much more automated systems, but I would call it more of an onboarding experience to get them to that place. I'd actually love to just talk to you more about this because I think it's super interesting if you're open to it. Cool.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jennifer. Okay, Jim has a question in here about continuity. Would you like to come on and ask your question, Jim?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. I think the idea of having different owners for different stages in the pipeline is something I haven't seen before. And it seems it would create a challenge of maintaining continuity of the learning and the key issues relative to each individual venture as they mature through the stages. So how do you recommend, this, how do you reconcile that challenge with this approach, I guess, of having different owners for different stages in the process?
Sure. Well, to clarify, the innovation team isn't necessarily evolving stage to stage. It's the investor, if you will. And so when we think about like what I've personally seen at large organizations is you have somebody who's in charge of internal innovation, idea management kind of things. Then you have somebody else who's in charge of venture capital or CVC, internal ventures, or a venture studio. You have somebody else in charge of M&A. So the reality is companies are kind of doing this anyway. They're just not connecting it all together. So you have like your early idea person who kind of owns this and your venture person who owns this piece. And so what we're talking about is actually taking what people are already doing and helping bring those pieces of the pipeline together to work more seamlessly. Because what I haven't seen is somebody that owns the internal innovation ideas that's actually able to like spin out a whole new business unit because they carry that whole entire thing on their backs by themselves.
Gotcha. Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. So mapping these to different execution models for how you achieve that growth, right? Whether it's venture investment or M&A, right? Versus carrying it all the way through. I was kind of assuming that you're carrying the venture through these stages of their evolution, and that those would be difficult transitions to maintain continuity if they're different owners of the portfolio.
Yeah, this is my terrible 30-second answer in a 30-minute call, but I would also I'm happy to engage with you as well and continue to have that conversation.
Yeah, and there could be different skill sets too required for different stages as well. So,
absolutely.
Right. Thanks so much, Jim, for checking in on that. Yeah, we're going to just kind of open things up here a bit. Doesn't seem like we have any other questions coming in via the chat. So just want to open this up to kind of an open conversation, and feel free to come on camera and check in. Comments, questions, feedback. I think all are encouraged and welcomed.
Also, if we didn't talk about
another one, if you want.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting looking at sort of the Air Force as a client. So how did you go about sort of adjusting sort of the evaluation criteria differently for a government agency versus a for-profit business?
Yeah. Well, actually, in some ways, it's really similar. In some ways, it's pretty different. So the similarities are you still got to find product market fit. You still have to find how a lot of the different, make something that creates value, the traditional challenges, if you will. There's also like a whole nother world of cybersecurity issues, contracting issues, and 9 reasons for ideas to fail because there's a giant bureaucracy. So I would say that we've actually just added bureaucratic factors to help figure out, like, have you gotten through figuring out how to get access to IT, like at an early stage. And now a lot of these happen for corporates too, but the fascinating thing that happens at the Air Force is because it's such a large organization, it's like these problems are huge and in your face, where at a corporate, it's a little bit harder to see them because the bureaucracy is a little lighter to see, if you will.
All right, Tyler, thanks for checking in here. You want to come on and talk a little bit more about maturity?
Yeah, it seems like that was a process of going from one stage to the other. How do you know when you're ready to layer on that next level of discipline to the strategy and the governance of the program?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's when it's starting to feel easy. It's everyone's aligned. We feel pretty good about, we roughly have the same data. So, or we roughly agree that this is the right data to collect. And so we're all feeling like we've done a couple cadences that we're on the same step and we feel like we can take it to the next level. I am curious to hear if, are we talking about here what you guys were expecting to hear, or were you expecting to hear other kinds of other kinds of information or questions here at this talk? And so I'm curious to hear if there's any other kinds of things people were hoping to talk about. Not all at once.
I'm curious about your, this presentation to me seemed very, I don't know the right term, human-centric versus maybe like technology-centric, right? And so I'm just curious, clearly there's a technology layer to this that you're working on. I'm wondering if you can share a little bit more about how, either that works, or I know you alluded to it maybe in your presentation where the more automated technology component might come at a later stage, or it's a more mature, or you're more engaged with a client. So I don't know if you have any thoughts or reactions to that, like the human side versus the technology side.
Yeah, absolutely. So here's the interesting thing is there's definitely a lot of human pieces to it, but there's standard data collection that happens across all of these human elements. I'd actually compared a lot to sales. Sales is a very human process, but at the end of the day, you're going to go from having a prospect, figuring out if they're qualified. I don't know how many people here have run kind of sales processes before, but like you basically have to figure out, are they somebody who could buy something? If so, then I'm going to move into a proposal. If so, then and that they're interested in that, then I'm going to move into a contract. And there's a lot of these very concrete steps to move forward with. But at the same time, everything is human. Everything moves in lots of different directions. But Salesforce ultimately is a tool that helps manage all the opportunities. It helps salespeople move the opportunities forward. In that same way, we see a huge opportunity with innovation to collect standardized data to help innovation leaders mature their portfolio and mature their capabilities and actually be able to show their leaders what progress looks like, and then have their innovators do the same thing. Because what happens is innovation actually requires a huge pipeline to be successful, right? 19 out of 20 opportunities fail. So if you actually hold on to 20 ventures or 20 ideas to long enough, or really probably 200 for what you're trying to accomplish at work, the idea of doing that all manually is impossible. So I feel like innovation leaders are in this bind where they're constantly having to figure out, how do I get enough output, but how do I manage all these human relationships? And we see this great opportunity to collect data at the right points in the right time to take that stress off of them of having to keep all that information in their head and leverage a tool that can help keep it human in the right places.
I love it. That's great. We got to keep the human aspect in innovation. Well, thanks so much for everybody for participating. We're going to start to bring the session to a close here, but want to just kind of reiterate that this is kind of an opening conversation. Feel free to continue having a dialogue on the Innovators platform. There's going to be a link. It's in the chat now. Great. Thank you for that, Max. There's a link in the chat to continue the conversation on the platform. If you'd like to facilitate a conversation with Rachel, it sounds like she's absolutely available. And with that, we're complete. Thanks again for joining. Max also dropped a link into the chat for the next session, and we hope to see you there. So with that, we are complete. Thank you for your time.
Thanks so much. Oh, thanks. Bye.
Thank you.